Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the YouTube channel of Instituto Cervantes, Manchester and Leeds. My name is Pedro Eusebio, and I am the director of Instituto Cervantes in those two cities in Northern England. First of all, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to Professor Idoia Elola and Professor Anna Oskoz, who are the coordinators of this series of lectures. And also, of course, I would like to extend this welcome to our special guest, Dr. Paola Guerrero-Rodríguez. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias por aceptar la invitación. The series, Acquiring a Second Language, Why Do We Find It So Difficult, is a forum aimed at parents, students, and also language students and the general public as well, in which we are trying to analyze and to consider how we learn a second language or also a heritage language. And the participants in this series of talks are discussing the various elements and difficulties that come with second language acquisition, including the myths and the realities surrounding the language acquisition. Tonight, we have the third talk of 2024. This program started, we are now in the second year, and the title is Can We Hear Race? Now you see me, now you hear me. Raciolinguistic identity negotiation in the Spanish language classroom and as a contact zone. In this talk, the Dr. Paola Guerrero-Rodríguez will analyze and will consider the implications of phrase and language in the Spanish language classroom and the strategies that the educators and the educational system can follow to counteract the negative effects of racialization. As we know, the multilingual areas, the language classroom becomes a contact zone where each individual brings their own background, heritage, life experiences, life expectancies as well, and the raciolinguistic dynamics that have impacted them do not stay outside the classroom walls. They come along and accompany these individuals and shape their learning and socialization experience. By recognizing the dynamic interplay between these elements mentioned, society can work towards fostering an inclusivity and embracing the richness of linguistic and racial diversity. In that sense, this talk is especially important because, as you might know, in Instituto Cervantes, we also have a series about bilingualism and the importance of heritage language. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And before I pass the word to Idoia and Anna, I will introduce them, and then they will also introduce our special guest, Paola. Idoia Elola is professor of Spanish and Applied Linguistics in the Department of Classical and Modern Languages and Literatures at the Texas Tech University. Dr. Elola is co-editor-in-chief of the journal System, and her research focuses primarily on digital second language writing, specifically on areas such as collaborative and individual writing using social tools, multiliteracies, feedback, and the use of multimodal texts from cognitive and sociocultural perspectives. She also focuses on second language and SHL learners' writing processes. Her work has been published nationally and internationally, and she has co-edited 2 books: Current Theoretical and Applied Perspectives on Spanish and Lusophone Linguistics with Diego Pascual y Cabo, and Technology Across Writing, Context and Task with Greg Kressler and Anna Oskoz. Her co-authored book, Digital Second Language Writing Literacies with Anna Oskoz, was published by Equinox Publishing. Dr. Ana Oskoz is professor of Spanish in the Department of Modern Languages, Linguistics, and Intercultural Communication at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She's also Vice Provost of Faculty Affairs and is the co-editor of Calico Journal, the official publication of the Computer Assisted Language Instruction Consortium, which is devoted to the dissemination of information concerning the application of technology to the language teaching and language learning. Her research focuses on the potential of social digital tools to contribute to learners of second language writing. She has examined collaborative and individual writing using social tools, multiliteracy, feedback, and the use of multimodal text. Dr. Scott's works has been published nationally and internationally, and she has co-edited 2 books, Technology Across Writing Contexts and Tasks with Gerd Kessler and Idoia Elola, and Understanding Attitude in Intercultural Visual Communication with Margarita Vinagre. She also co-authored the book Digital L2 Writing with Idoia Elola. And now they will introduce our special guest, the speaker, Dr. Paola Guerrero-Rodríguez, who is Assistant Professor of Hispanic Linguistics and Director of the Spanish Heritage Language Program at the Texas Tech University. Muchísimas gracias a las tres, muchas gracias a nuestro público y sin más les paso la palabra.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure for us to be here again with all of you. We thank the audience for being with us, and we thank again the Instituto Cervantes and Leeds for inviting us to coordinate this series. So, as you have already mentioned, the third speaker for the Spring 2024 series is Paola Guerrero-Rodríguez. Paola's research focuses on heritage language learners, and those who have learned a language at home but don't have academic training in it, in this case in Spanish. And she focuses in particular on the dynamics that take place in the heritage language classroom and the mixed classroom. And this is when heritage language learners are in classes with second language learners. In her work, Paola aims to explore and uncover better pedagogical practices that meet the needs of heritage language speakers in both learning and pedagogical contexts. The reason for inviting Paola to this talk resides in her work with the power dynamics that impact language use, and also in how those dynamics use language as a vehicle to perpetuate discrimination. Very important to us as heritage and second language instructors is that Paola examines how the language classroom is a setting that can help stop perpetuating discriminatory discourses.
You might think that because Paola and I are in the same institution, I am completely biased, but that's not the case. Even though she's a faculty junior or junior faculty, she already has an impressive profile. She's invited as a keynote speaker, is involved in different national and local organizations that work with the Spanish heritage language learners, has published articles and chapters, and is currently preparing a monograph on telecollaboration and heritage speakers with Routledge. 3 years she's been with us as a professor, and she's already changing the world. One thing we admire about Paola is her commitment to and activism towards racial linguistics and her care toward her students, her colleagues, and the local communities around her. She's already a mover and shaker in the field of heritage language learners. Her teaching is recognized for inspiring students and peers, and I've seen that, how she's adored by everybody. And for these reasons, Paola is here today to inspire us to raise language awareness and engage us in linguistic activism in a world in which linguistic minorities still struggle. And without more delay, Paola, the floor is yours.
When you hear me, that adds an extra layer to your original idea.
Okay, well, so this was an activity that I wanted you to reflect a little bit before I started speaking, and you clearly form an idea of who I am or where I may be from. So as I said in that short introduction, when you see a person, in this case, let's think about me, you see my physical characteristics and unconsciously or consciously may form an idea of where I am from. So if by looking at me, you may see that I am, or I can be from different places. I will let you know where I am from in a little bit. But first, what you have learned about me, besides looking at my face, is my name. So my name is Paola Guerrero-Rodríguez. And what seems something very simple for me and was something very simple for me up to when I moved from Mexico to the United States, here it is not that simple. For me and for all of us, our names form our identities, are part of that big identity that we have and how we are presented to the world. Here you can see that I have two last names, as I usually say here in the United States, Guerrero and Rodriguez. And that is part of who I am, because Guerrero is like that a heritage that I have from my father, and Rodriguez represents my mom in my name. That is why when I moved into the US, I have to hyphenate my name in order not to lose any of those big parts of my identity. And then when I move into the United States, besides struggling with the pronunciation of my name, sometimes being called Paula, Payola, Paola, or any other kind of pronunciation, Guerrero-Rodríguez represents like a difficulty for some English native speakers. And then what everybody sees is that that is a Hispanic or Latinx name. And then you listen to my accent, that is not the accent that you originally listened to while I was being introducing this talk, because I asked a friend to record that short part of that video. So you listen that I am not an English native speaker. And then you start forming an idea of who I am. You already have my physical characteristics, then you see my name, and then you listen to my accent. And that is why this talk is called Can We Hear Race? Now You See Me, Now You Hear Me, because all of that forms part of who you are in terms of your raciolinguistic identity. And here, let's make things a little bit more complicated. I originally said that I am from Mexico, and in Mexico, I grew up as a white person, as a Spanish native speaker, which also made me a monolingual speaker, because I was raised as a monolingual speaker. I started learning English when I was 18 years old. So that's probably one of the reasons why I have this accent that you are listening to while I speak English. And also, I am a non-Afro descendant person. And why would you say that? Is this relevant for my identity? Well, I assume most of us here have usually or already completed the census of our countries, where we are required to answer certain questions. In Mexico, one of the questions that we are required to answer like in I would say that the last census, because this was not part of the original census when I was a child, they ask you if you are from an Afro-descendant origin, because they are now represented in our census, and we are acknowledging that Afro-descendants are part of our culture. So far, because in the past they were invisible. That is why all of these are parts of who I am in Mexico. And that is part of who I am as a person and how I was raised. However, when I came to the United States in the last census, 2020 census, we all remember that year because of what happened, and we already know the pandemic and everything. But for me, besides the pandemic, it was also a year when this idea of race started to change a little bit in this country, in the United States. right here, we have this question where you are required to say if you are a person of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. And of course, here I say, yes, I am Mexican or Chicano or Mexican American. Anything that involves Mexican, that's where I am here. And that's what I proudly say. But then you have another question that is not what I was used to answer when I was back in Mexico. And they ask you, what is this person's race? And then you find this: white, for example, German, Irish, English, Italian, Lebanese, Egyptian, no Mexican there, nothing that looks like me. I'm not from any of those countries. Then we go to Black or African American, and then I don't find myself represented there either. And then American Indian or Alaska Native, I don't see anything. I may see here Mayan, Aztec, but I don't know if I know that I have that kind of heritage, but I have never say I am Mayan or Aztec because I don't speak the language, and none of my close family are Aztecs or Mayans. We unfortunately don't keep that as part of our identity for me to have this on the census. And then when I look at all of these other examples, I don't see myself. So what am I supposed to write there? If I was white in Mexico, what does it mean here in the United States? Because I don't see any Hispanic represented there. Then I learned that Hispanics can be anything from this list. But that was something that had to be added as a note in the census of 2020 in the United States. So what happens when I am at work? I usually receive this kind of emails where people say, faculty of color success, Fireside Chat panelist opportunity. Come and share your story as a faculty of color. Faculty of color belongingness experiences study, or survey reminder from faculty of color success subcommittee. Well, I guess in here you can see that I am not perceived as a white person anymore. Although I grew up as a white person in Mexico, and when I go back there, the treatment that I receive there is as a white person. In here, I am not a white person anymore. It's like if I had two personalities, two ways of people perceiving who I am. In Mexico, I am white. In the United States, I am a person of color, regardless of what the census says, that I can check any of those boxes: white, African American, Black, indigenous person. I am a person of color because that is how people would perceive me and how people would treat me here. I am Mexican, yes. In here, we add another label. I am also Hispanic, Latinx. For some people, I am Chicana, although Chicana is something that you decide to self-identify as, not that somebody tells you to, but I may be Chicana for some people. I am a Spanish native speaker, but in here, I am a non-English native speaker. So it is like if I had two different racial linguistic identities, how do I reconcile this? How do I come to the classroom and present myself to my students if what I used to be in one country is not what I am here anymore? People would perceive me in different ways depending on where they are from. And that is why this is also part of the title. The classroom, the language classroom especially, becomes contact zones. Small contact zones where we have our own identities from where we grew up, and then we find our students, and they have their own identities, racial linguistic identities, and their own struggles and their own negotiations. We're not that different in that regard. However, my question here is, how does a student's racial linguistic identity impact and are impacted in the Spanish language classroom? Well, here at Texas Tech, I teach a class that talks about racial linguistics. And I have one of my students kindly agreed for me to use part of one of her reflections to share with you all. And this goes back to the question that I have just asked. And this reads, prior to that class, how often had I just walked into a classroom without thinking about how everyone else was looking at me, or offered my comments or responses without worrying about whether other classmates were watching or evaluating what I said? When I read that, I saw myself reflected there, because in Mexico, I always walked into a classroom, I offered my opinions, and I didn't even think about how my ideas, my race could impact others. Because the small town where I grew up, everybody looked like me. That's how I saw people. Nobody was that different of me. Even if we saw a person like an Afro-Mexican person, we were not aware that that was part of our identity, because at school, that was a race that is foreign to us. It wasn't present there. It wasn't my reality. So I just was in a very comfortable zone where everybody had their struggles, but not with race. It was until I came to the United States where I had to be more aware of how I was perceived and how I would perceive others. And then this same student, Taylor, continues. And yet, college students from minority racial groups deal with that on a consistent basis. This experience objectively made me more aware of how frequently my race, as it is defined in the United States, has benefited me without my being conscious of it. This idea is very powerful, because in this country, in the United States, and I would say that in most countries now, we have minority racial communities. Even when we are not aware of it, they are there. And migration is changing the way that we are dealing with race nowadays. But she says something very interesting here. My race as it is defined in the United States. And this comes to the idea of what is race? Because I had that idea that race is something that to me was not important, something that I didn't have to use to check a box on the census in my country, something that was not something that I would need to pay a lot of attention to when I was back in Mexico. But let's see what is race defined by different perspectives. So first we have the biological perspective, where race is defined as a set of biological features that distinguish individuals without justifying any social hierarchy among races. Then we have race as a socially constructed groups that have different ways of life. And the third one is races are sociopolitical groups who have marked bodily features. These groups function within dominance hierarchies. What does this say? That race is not a universal construct, that we make our own idea of race based on our societies. It is not my definition, was not the definition that they have here in the United States, and it may be different from people in the audience. So as I am talking about the United States, we can say that the third definition is the one that usually applies to this country, where we have different hierarchies depending on the race that you are perceived, not the race that you think you belong to. So we have here the map of the United States. And here is where we can have these contact zones. Of course, all the country is a contact zone, and you perceive that everywhere. But let's focus on the classroom. We have, on the one hand, international students, that I was one of them in the past. I am still considered a foreign alien because that's the wording that they would use for foreign people. And then we have domestic students, and then we have the teacher. So I was once here, now I am here. That the fact that I was an international student and that I am now a professor doesn't change the way my race is perceived. It just changes maybe the money that I make or the kind of activities that I do on a daily basis. But if we look a little bit more detailed into these contact zones, we have here in domestic students, the second language learners, the native speakers, and a subset of those native speakers are heritage speakers. And Anna, at the beginning of this presentation, talked a little bit about who heritage speakers are. And for all of us to remember what she said, these people are just individuals who grew up in households where Spanish was spoken, and they are bilingual to some extent in English and in Spanish. This definition of heritage speaker focuses on the context of the United States, but you can use it just by changing the languages that we have here. So me as a professor, what should I do in this kind of context where I have my own struggles with my own idea, my own identities? Then I have international students that I can relate to because maybe our experiences are somehow similar. And then we have domestic students that think about race based on how they were raised, my own ideas. So this becomes like a melting pot. That is one of the best words to define the United States, and also the classroom as a contact zone. Okay, so we have already talked about the idea of race and how it is perceived differently, mostly based on where you grew up or the kind of a place where you have spent most of your life. And also with that idea, it comes the idea of native speakers. And as I said, I presented myself here as an English non-native speaker. That can easily be perceived based on the way that I make the sounds of this language. So if you remember, at the beginning of this talk, I also talked about how I needed to hyphenate my name, or in this case, my last name, for it to become one and don't lose parts of my identity that are important for me, my father heritage and my mom's heritage. So there is something interesting that happens here. And we have here President Roosevelt in 1919, when he was addressing the American Defense Society, talking about English monolingualism with loyalty to America. And these are his words. And he would say back then, like a century ago, we have room for but one language here, and that is the English language. For we intend to see that the crucial turns our people out as Americans of American nationality and not as dwellers in a polyglot boarding house. And we have room for but one sole loyalty, and that is the loyalty to the American people. And this comes back to the idea of race and language, and how in these kind of societies, they become one, because I am a person of color, not because of my skin color. It is because of where I am from, the language that I speak. And when you see this that was said in 1919, well, like 100 plus years later, we still find this very relevant. And we still see that English in this society is the language that talks about how your identity should be presented. And in here, the struggle is even harder, because race and language, and then I have the classroom, and then what do I do as a professor? What do I do as a student? Because in the United States, students can also teach and be students at the same time. So they have these same difficulties that I am expressing here, struggling with their own identities and how they are presented in the classroom. So to make things a little bit more complicated, we have on the one hand race, then we have language, and then we have this context of appropriateness and the white gaze. And what is all of this? Well, first we have this context of appropriateness, that is that idea of the standardized linguistic practices that we as speakers should adhere to. We should speak the standard language. And I guess most of us who are linguists are always wondering who speaks the standard language, who gets to determine what is the standard language. And that is, when we teach languages, something that we are usually worried about. What kind of Spanish, in this case, I am teaching my students? Do I teach the language or the dialect that I know, or should I teach the dialect that they know, especially when we talk about heritage speakers that grew up in a different society than the one that I grew up in? So we have that. And then we have the white gaze. And this is a perspective that privileges dominant white perspectives on the linguistic and cultural practices of racialized communities. And this is really important when we remember what I first talked about, this idea of what race is and how it is perceived. Because right here, when we talk about white gaze, it is not necessarily people that are white. It is more like that perspective, that ideology that has one community above the other in terms of race. And here, Spanish in the United States, in some places, is a minoritized language. So it comes with that idea of the communities that speak Spanish. They usually come with those ideas of being undocumented or being illiterate or not speaking the appropriate Spanish. And all of that goes back to race as it is perceived in the United States. And then we have these racial-linguistic ideologies that we as professors, we have them. Some of them are conscious, some of them are unconsciously perceived, but we all do have racial linguistic ideologies. In here, what it is talking about, to go back to this idea of appropriateness and the white gaze, it is the link, they link, the white speaking and listening subject to monoglossic language ideologies that position idealized monolingualism in an standardized national language as the norm to which all national subjects should aspire. Do you remember this quote that I read from President Roosevelt from 1919? Here, Flores and Rosa, a century later, are still talking about these ideologies of what the norm is. And what the norm should be is that idea of the white speaking and listening. And I repeat this again. White is not the white as the individual is perceived as a white person, but rather that ideology of that person that is in power and that person that speaks the standard language. And that is something that we should consider, especially when we are teaching languages, because some of us could have received a more prescriptive education that we bring with us to the classroom. And it is not our fault. It is how we were educated. But now that we have all of these resources available, we should start wondering what we do in the classroom, especially when they are contact zones where different dialects concur and different ideologies are present. So in this case, what we have is that racial linguistic ideologies that combine certain racialized bodies with linguistic deficiency produced racialized speaking subjects who are constructed as linguistically deviant, even when engaging in linguistic practices positioned as normative or innovative when produced by privileged white subjects. What do all of this mean? Well, in here, we are talking about race and the way we are perceived. The way that we are perceived as a racialized individuals goes back to the way that we speak. when I am perceived as a white person, regardless of my skin color, if I am perceived as a white person, my privilege when speaking a language is higher than when I am a racialized individual from a minority community, even though we are speaking the same language with the same kind of linguistic features, the perception is not going to be the same because we have that burden of what race we belong to. And all of this goes back to our teaching and the teaching practices that we bring to our classroom, especially when we have speakers of minority communities. So what do we do? Here, there is something important because even though we usually talk about minority communities, this idea of heritage speakers, long-term English learners, and standard English learners, what makes the difference between them is not the lack of proficiency in the language. It is the racial positioning in society that makes the difference between these speakers. Even among English learners, long-term English learners, it's not the same for me being a Hispanic person here than probably a different person from another country that also is a long-term English learner and that makes mistakes when speaking the language. We're not going to be perceived the same because we are racially positioned in this society. In this case, what is the solution that Flores and Rosa propose? They are advocating, and I agree entirely with them, that the solution to marginalization of language minoritized students cannot be solely add objective linguistic practices repertoires, meaning standard repertoires, but instead to challenge the ways that language minoritized student practices are taken up and interpreted by the white listening subject. In this case, if you remember the language classroom as a contact zone, when we have second language learners, native speakers, and the subset of native speakers that are heritage speakers, we have a really valuable opportunity to challenge these minoritized ideas because we have all parts of the society that are in our small world, that is the language classroom, and the way that we teach them is an opportunity for us to challenge the ways that everybody in the outside world is perceived. So if we start challenging that idea of a standard language, what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, and acknowledge that we all speak differently, especially when we are in bilingual or monolingual societies, that is something that can really have an impact in the outside world beyond our classroom. So we really have a very powerful position as language teachers. And with this, I have my take-home message for you, and I would like you to reflect on these questions. First, does my raciolinguistic identity, oh, you see, I made a mistake there. And you may be seeing me differently based on my race, who knows? But is my raciolinguistic identity a privilege? Where? How does my raciolinguistic identity impact my teaching practices? How does the raciolinguistic identities of my students impact my teaching practices? And most importantly, do I create spaces where students reflect on the fact that, as Dr. Martin Luther King once said, we may have all come on different ships, but we are in the same boat now. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention. Muchas gracias. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paola, for this very enlightening presentation. I would like to first ask to the audience if they had any questions. Maybe do we need to share the PowerPoint any longer?
I think we can.
Yes. So any questions for the audience?
I have a question for Paola. Thank
Okay.
you, first of all, for this brilliant presentation. And you refer in your talk about what can be done or how in the classroom this reality of racialized people and to accept, let's say in a simple way, the diversity as a normal pattern, not the exception. What do you do precisely in your daily basis work in the classroom to put in practice what you had this express in your talk?
Thank you. And I really appreciate that question, because this is one thing is saying that in theory, and then how do I do it in the actual practice, right? So what I do is that whenever I teach Spanish, or I train TAs or teaching assistants to teach their own classrooms, I usually try to make them conscious about the fact that Spanish is not a foreign language in the United States. And I try to implement or bring to the classroom the linguistic practices that are present here in the United States. So not treating Spanish as the Mexican dialect, since Mexico is very close to the United States, is the one that I should teach, or it's the one that I know. What I do is try to bring these lexical features that the Spanish from the United States, for example, has, the code switching, the borrowings, the calques, and I incorporate them in the teaching of the Spanish language, making students conscious that this is probably the kind of Spanish that they will use when talking to a person in the street or in the market or something. So instead of just focusing on Spanish as something that is foreign, I do it as is something that is domestic. And I try to ask students to bring their own repertoires, the words that they already know, the words that they have heard with their parents, with other kids, even the second language learners, they are in contact with that kind of Spanish. And I think that just making presence of those linguistic features of Spanish from the United States is helping students destigmatize that other dialects that we have in the Spanish world. And just briefly to add to that, I think that just recognizing that there is no standard Spanish or that nobody speaks a standard language, because they usually come with that idea of, oh, I should speak like that person, or Spanish from this country. Is that what I should do? So just bringing these kind of conversations to the classroom, and try to have also authors that are representative of those communities. I am speaking about the United States, but it can be adapted to any other country. Just bring the local to the classroom instead of just making the language as something that is foreign. And I think that is and I hope that I answered your question, but that is what I usually do.
Thank you. Yes, very clear. Thank you very much.
Paola, I have a question for you.
Yes,
Following
Ana.
up with what Marta asked.
Mhm.
How do students, and I know you have taught mostly at Texas Tech, you also were in Florida. How do students respond to this racial linguistics approach in the classroom? And do you see what are the differences, if there is any difference between heritage language learners and second language learners to this idea of looking at language from this very different perspective? Do you see any difference? What are the challenges? Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Anna. That's a really great question, because right now with these kind of topics may be difficult to be talked about and to bring to the classroom, especially because of some state laws that are different from state to state. So Florida and Texas are right now places where talking about the race is not like probably the preferred topic for politicians, and that also impacts our teaching practices. So what I usually do is that I start with what I was telling Marta, asking students about themselves, how they would perceive themselves. And I start from the micro, and then I go to the macro. And when I do that, I think that students start being a little bit more conscious about how they are part of the society and how they can have certain privileges that other people do not have. And I think that that breaks the ice and breaks that resistance, because if I start just by saying, let's talk about race and racial linguistics, like at the beginning, they are going to be like, no, 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 what is this? I don't want to be in this classroom. Like, no, this is very uncomfortable. So I go like step by step, and I usually start with the English language. And being in the southern part of the United States, Florida and Texas, that has really helped. I know that you are not in the South, but talking about the different ideologies behind the English language, that really helps, because then I move to the Spanish language, but they already have that idea that that exists in their own language, and that it is not something that is foreign or that just happens in Spanish. And then I start also talking about the community, and I ask them if they see differences in the way that people talk, the places that they usually go to, if there are certain stores that are preferred by certain communities. And so I make them part of this idea of exploring what race looks like in their own community. And that is when they are comfortable to be having these kind of discussions about race, and that's when I bring the theory. That at the beginning I just start with what they know, that is their communities and the English language.
Gracias.
A ti.
Someone is asking for your email, I think, Paola, so they can contact you. I was going to ask you, it seems like in order to realize that we have these biases, we either need to be in a situation in which they let us know that we are different, I suppose. I don't know how else to say it. And so how it's important, obviously, to bring that to the classroom, but it's also how do we change that views of people who are not in our classrooms? And I know that we start little by little with the people next to us, but the moment that you said that you were a faculty of color, this is the same reaction I had when I was told that because I'm from Spain, I'm a faculty of color. And so that is a rearrangement of how to position yourself everywhere you go. So
Yes.
how, I mean, I'm just not asking a good question here, but how do we change that outside the classroom? What are the other things that we can do in our day-to-day lives to make that change? And obviously you've done the first step to talk to students about that so they can then, you know, become a bigger network. But this is a big issue for everybody. I mean, we're talking about not only the classroom, but how countries are positioning themselves against each other, more conflict than ever, these political, I don't know, state rules that or laws, you know, the fact that we cannot write the word diversity in our syllabi, you know, as it happens in Texas. How is that somehow impacting us at a different level than it was before?
No, I completely agree, though. Yeah, right now it's a little bit even scary just to talk about these kind of things. Even just to say the word diversity, that's scary, because you hear to that word and it's just like, should I be talking about this? Should I not? Should I bring that to the classroom? Should I not? And what I have been doing is just talking to people that are, whether we like it or not, empowered, and explain to them, because sometimes you would be surprised that some people, since they have been in the States most of their life, they don't even know that race is something that it is not a universal, that we see race differently. And I have been having these kind of conversations with some people that direct certain programs around university, and explaining to them that I don't feel comfortable being labeled as a person of color. And it is not because of my skin color, but it is because I feel that I am stealing somebody's history, and that they are giving me an idea, an identity that they are deciding because I am from Mexico, that I am going to be this and not that. So just having this kind of conversations with them in a friendly way, or having talks around like different departments, talking to people, getting to know other colleagues that are not in the language department, because this is something that we are very conscious about, the race and language and everything, that people from different colleges, different universities may have a different idea. So what I would suggest is, just if there is a local symposium or a local event, just go and present and talk about that. I think that that is something that we should be a little bit more vocal about it, especially in places where it is very challenging to even talk about these things. I think that those are still safe spaces, so to speak. So in local symposiums or events organized by the institution, I think that we have a chance there, just even if it is just like 5 minutes, to talk about this and explain that race is not something that is universally understood, and that we should be working a little bit harder to try to understand the diversity here.
Yeah, because we are not talking about privileged languages, because that racial linguistics exists within those privileged languages as well. I mean, Marta was talking about her students that, you know, this like very homogeneous and all of that, but they don't even think about racial linguistics in English. You know, they haven't really explored that idea that it's not different races. I mean, the perspective, like when you talk about white perspective, it's not that you are just white. It's like that is the perspective that permeates everything that we do, or how we see the world.
Exactly.
And so they are unaware of that white perspective. I mean, you can have people from many places and say, no, this is the prestige language, but this is the dialogue that I would like to use, not knowing that they are actually using a white perspective, and that's what they are not aware of at all. So it's not just the privileged language, oh, this is a person from Spain, or this is a person from Mexico, where it's further than that. And that's why I find it so complicated, complex, and beautiful at the same time, because there's a different type of dialogue that we need to have. And that's why how to do it is the question.
And I also would like to add that sometimes at some institutions, I see that there is, and not that I complain about it, but there is an overrepresentation of Mexican culture, and that association that Hispanic equals Mexican. And when they have events, everything that they will bring to that event is mariachi or Mexican dances and everything. And it is like, yeah, I see that you are making that effort to have representation, but it's not just Mexico, the one that needs being represented there. So that's like kind of the other side of the coin. And I think that having those kind of conversations, or presenting at those symposium that I was just talking about, I think that that opens people's mind, because as you said, sometimes people are not aware that they are doing that, and they don't mean bad. I mean, they mean well, but they are still doing the opposite.
Yeah.
We have a comment in the chat from Marina Saez. This is really interesting. Thank you so much. I am part of a team of education advisors working on how to diversify the curriculum. I look after the linguistic aspects, and dialect and accent is at the forefront of every workshop. This webinar is going to give me more examples, perspectives, and quotes to add to my training. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Yeah, and I think that this kind of events as well. So this is like a great opportunity for us to have this kind of discussions with people that are beyond our immediate communities or our inner circles. So having these kind of spaces, I think that it goes beyond the classroom as well. So thank you so much for this invitation, because I think that this is a way to advocate, to start destigmatizing this certain kind of dialects, and with that, the communities that speak those dialects.
And one thing that I think, Pedro, you didn't mention today is the fact that this is recorded. And so there's a
No,
lot
I
of people
didn't.
that see
Usually
it.
I do, but today I didn't.
So the people that you see here is not the people that are actually seeing this presentation, because wasn't that sometimes you have like 200 and more people watching the videos after the presentation has been finalized?
Awesome.
Yeah, it
That-
goes to a global forum, and this is, I mean, for us Hispanics, maybe it's so obvious that what makes rich Spanish language is precisely the diversity. I mean, it's it goes without, it couldn't go without that. But yes, we are happy to have you today and to put the accent and those aspects which are so important for everybody, and also for Instituto Cervantes as institution promoting the Hispanic culture as a culture where we have the language as, pero como dijo Gabriela Mistral, que nos une pero que no nos ata, y que precisamente es a través de la diversidad como mejor se representa.
Yeah, that's very good. Any more questions that you might have? No?
No. Bueno, yo por mi parte daros las gracias, Paola, Ana, Idoia, por esta magnífica presentación. Y para terminar, pues voy a citar a Carlos Fuentes, mexicano, pero global hispano, que decía que el español es una lengua americana que nació en Europa, y creo que resume muy bien la diversidad y lo que es el español hoy en día y desde siempre, ¿no? Esa diversidad que es lo que nos enriquece. Muchísimas gracias y...